So, let's start at the beginning. I've always been very clear about my own approach to studying John Wesley. I have never aspired to be a historian, at least not in the sense of people like Lyle V.Y., the H. Green, or Richard Heisenrater. These scholars are brilliant. Of course, they devote their lives to historical research, to reconstructing the past with as much accuracy and detail as possible. That's a noble endeavor, and it has tremendous value. But my focus is a little different. I am unapologetically an orthodox scholar, which means I approach texts with a commitment to the truths they convey, especially the truths of classical Christian faith. At the same time, I have a lifelong interest in historical wisdom, because understanding the past helps us grasp the richness of Christian thought. But my work is primarily theological, rather than historical in the strict sense. What does that mean practically? It means I work unashamedly according to the methods of classic Christian exegesis. I read the texts carefully. I pay attention to their language, their structure, their historical and theological context, and I try to discern the meaning that the author intended. This is the foundation of what we today call a theology of revelation, a way of studying scripture and theological writings that take seriously the idea that God's truth has been communicated to humanity in a real and meaningful way. Now, I know that some historians might look at this approach and think, well, that sounds implausible, or maybe even impossible. After all, they might argue that the only safe way to study someone like Wesley is by tracing historical sources, influences, and development. That's valid, but it's not my aim here. My purpose is to show that it is entirely viable to study Wesley in this way, as a theologian whose work can be understood systematically and cohesively. Albert Outler, my incomparable mentor, did something extraordinary for Wesleyans. He made Wesley accessible as a folk theologian, someone whose thought could be appreciated by ordinary believers. Within the Wesleyan tradition, Outler's work was invaluable, and it continues to influence scholars and pastors alike. But my goal is slightly different. I want to make Wesley accessible to non-Wesleyans, to show that he can be appreciated as a wise teacher of classic Christianity, not just as a figure within the Methodist movement. I want people outside the Wesleyan family to recognize that Wesley's thought is coherent, insightful, and relevant to anyone interested in the Christian faith. I am not trying to ignore the fascinating historical question of how Wesley's theology developed over time. That's an important question, and Outler's work addresses it beautifully. But my question is slightly different. I want to ask, to what degree does the whole of Wesley's theological contribution hold together as a cohesive, organized whole? Is there a viable, organic conception and design underlying his work? Can we see, in his writings, a systematic core that ties everything together? And here's the thing. Those who start by assuming the answer is zero, that Wesley has no cohesive theological core, will have to be convinced by the texts themselves. They will need to see evidence in the writings that shows, beyond historical context, that there is indeed a solid core of teaching. That is my assignment, to demonstrate, from Wesley's own texts, that his theology is coherent, comprehensive, and systematic, even if it doesn't appear in the rigid structure of some academic treatises. A lot of people dismiss Wesley as unsystematic. They argue that because his writings were often occasional sermons for a specific audience, letters responding to a particular question, notes for personal reflection, there's no underlying method or structure. And yes, on the surface, it can look that way, but the truth is deeper. My goal is to show that, despite the occasional nature of many of his writings, there is a cohesive and implicitly systematic core that runs through all of them. You don't have to do mental gymnastics to see it. It's textually available to anyone willing to read carefully. The themes recur. The theological principles are consistent, and his reflections connect with one another in a way that creates a deliberate pattern of teaching. Wesley is, in fact, a special kind of systematic theologian. But unlike Schleiermacher or Barth, who are often cited as paragons of systematic theology, Wesley's system emerges directly from his pastoral experience. His theological reflections are not abstract exercises in intellectual rigor. They grow out of his active engagement with people's lives, struggles, and questions. This is particularly evident in his letters. Take Wesley's letters, for instance. On one level, they are filled with pastoral advice, moral guidance, encouragement, warnings, and spiritual exhortation. But if you look closely, you see that these letters are not just random thoughts thrown together. They are interrelated reflections, integrating moral, spiritual, and theological guidance into a connected pattern of deliberate reflection. That's why I argue that if someone is looking for a systematic theologian deeply grounded in pastoral care, they may actually find more of that in Wesley than in Schleiermacher or Barth, who, while systematic, were often more abstract and less grounded in daily pastoral engagement. Wesley's theology is lived and practiced theology. It's not only to be studied, but also to be applied and experienced in the life of a believer. And that pastoral and moral dimension is essential. It's one of the reasons his teachings continue to resonate today. It's one thing to read theology. It's another to see how it functions in real life, helping people navigate moral dilemmas, spiritual challenges, and personal growth. Wesley's letters and sermons provide a roadmap for practical Christian living, while still being coherent theologically. Here's a whimsical note I love to share. Wesley is often imagined as being excessively sober, austere, or humorless. People picture him as a man forever scowling, endlessly serious. But that's not the whole story. If you dig into his writings, you find moments of brilliant wit and comic perception, passages that sparkle with humor, irony, or clever observation. I decided not to isolate these passages into a separate section labeled humor. Instead, I let them lie quietly in the text, ready to be discovered by the attentive reader. This was deliberate because part of the joy of reading Wesley is the unexpected delight that emerges when you encounter these sparks of humor, and that joy is deeply connected to the good news he preached. Wesley found pleasure in the reality of God's coming, in the transforming work of grace, and in the lively, practical faith that he wanted others to experience. That sense of joy permeates his writings, and it's something I hope readers can encounter for themselves. Reading Wesley is not only an intellectual exercise, it's a delightful spiritual journey. Wesley's teachings are not just historically interesting, they are highly relevant to contemporary society. Think about some of the pressing issues today: addictive behaviors, poverty, nihilism, and social disconnection. Wesley's pastoral wisdom, practical guidance, and ethical teachings have much to say about these problems. That said, my main intention in this series is not to provide a programmatic solution to modern social crises. Instead, I want to highlight what readers are most likely to enjoy and benefit from. Wesley's good sense is grounded, practical understanding of human nature and society, his practical wisdom advice that is applicable to daily life, relationships, and moral decision-making. His non-speculative, earthy realism, a theology that is rooted in lived experience, not abstract speculation or overly complex theorizing. In short, reading Wesley is not just about learning doctrine. It's about engaging with a way of thinking and living that is coherent, joyful, and spiritually nourishing. To bring this all together, my aim in this project is to demonstrate that Wesley is 1. Systematic, even if his writings are occasional. There is a cohesive core that can be discerned. 2. Pastoral, deeply connected to the care of souls and the guidance of believers. 3. Joyful and witty. His humor and delight in God's good news enrich his theological vision. 4. Practically useful. His teachings have moral relevance and can be applied in devotional, ethical, and instructional contexts. 5. Historically grounded yet timeless, rooted in classical Christian exegesis and historical wisdom, but speaking meaningfully to contemporary life. By approaching Wesley in this way, we can see him not only as a founder of Methodism, but as a teacher of classic Christianity, whose thought remains coherent, insightful, and profoundly applicable centuries later. So, why does all of this matter? Because Wesley is more than a historical figure or a sectarian founder. He's a bridge between the ancient church and modern believers, between pastoral care and theological reflection, between joy and seriousness, between practical wisdom and systematic thought. Reading Wesley carefully as a systematic theologian rooted in pastoral care allows us to recover a living theology. We can see how he connects doctrine to practice, scripture to life, and historical wisdom to modern concerns. We can discover his humor, his joy, and his grounded realism, and we can apply his insights to our own lives, our communities, and even our broader society. In short, Wesley is waiting to be discovered again, not as a relic of the past, but as a guide for the present. A teacher whose wisdom is coherent, practical, and joyfully rooted in the good news of God's coming. And that is what this series seeks to share: the steady joy and enduring wisdom of one of the most remarkable theological minds in history, made accessible to all who are willing to read, reflect, and learn.